Hi, and welcome to JAMA Network Open Live. I'm Seth Truger, Digital Media Editor at JAMA Network Open.
And I'm Angel Desai, JAMA Fishbein Fellow.
So, of course, if you're following along live, please feel free to send us your questions and comments. You can add us at JAMA Network Open on Twitter or put the comments in the little box under the video on YouTube or Facebook. So we've got a really interesting article today, the Association of State Laws Regarding Snacks in U.S. Schools with Students' Consumption of Solid Fats and Added Sugars. And we have first author, Dr. Lindsay Turner, with us. Welcome.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and why you did the study.
So I am a research professor in the College of Education at Boise State. This is work that was done with my longtime collaborators at University of Illinois at Chicago. For probably 15 years, we've been looking at school nutrition, particularly looking at policies that impact the school nutrition environment. And a little over 9 years ago, in December of 2010, the Healthy Hunger for Kids Act was passed, and that was really a landmark change in the policy landscape, impacting 100,000 schools across the country. So as part of the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, one of the things that happened was that the USDA issued standards impacting all schools, all foods and beverages sold in schools outside of the school meals program. The first policy provision updated the standards for school meals. That was a really big change. And then this also, Smart Snacks, which we were talking about in our paper, was also a very, very large change. One of the first national changes to foods and beverages sold in places like vending machines, stores, and a la carte lines.
All right, great. And in this study, you were looking at the impact of state laws. So tell us about those state laws and how that, what was involved there, because it sounds like this was a federal law and USDA regs.
Yeah, it was. So particular interest of ours is how policies at different levels can work together in a complementary way. And some states have snack standards and had laws on the books requiring schools to implement those. So we were looking at the combination of state laws as a strategy to facilitate the implementation of these nationwide changes. We were really fortunate to have the ability to analyze really high quality, large scale data from a massive study funded by USDA. This is called the School Nutrition and Meal Cost Study. It was conducted in 2014-15 school year. It's done typically every 4 or 5 years as a very large national study of what's going on in school environments. And so we were able to leverage that data collection, adding on an additional piece where we looked at the state laws and how they worked with in combination with the patterns of diet we saw at school from the students.
Yeah, and from what you did report in the paper, you did 24-hour recall surveys with about 2,000 students, grades 1 through 12, so pretty broad there, and then basically compared kids in states where the states had essentially were enforcing or enacting laws supporting the smart snacks versus those that didn't. And then tell us what you found.
So we found that, and the comparison here again, in multivariate models where we accounted for a lot of different characteristics at the student level, as well as the type of school that they attended, and then the state where they attended, and then, of course, that policy variable at the state level. So what we found was no significant change in overall dietary intake, so total kcal per day. But Smart Snacks really was very specifically targeted toward a particular type of nutritional composition of snacks, solid fats and added sugar, and then also the third piece being sodium. The goal here really was to improve the dietary intake of students, getting rid of some of the excess of those what could be called empty calories. So those are the aspects that we specifically were interested in looking at. And indeed, we did find that students in the states where the schools were required to implement these standards, they were consuming on average 54 kcal less per day of that solid fat and added sugar. We didn't find a difference in sodium.
Yeah, actually, that was one of my questions was if you had any thoughts as to why sodium in particular may not have, there may not have been a difference there.
Whether we're talking about snacks outside of the meal program or the meal programs, those sodium targets have really been quite challenging for schools to implement. And so we're seeing that, that may be an area where some reformulation of different types of products might be necessary, and those partnerships with the producers of snack products.
Yeah, and I know 54 calories a day doesn't sound like a lot. I did some very back of the envelope calculations and using, basically divided 3,500 calories, which is the estimate for a pound, and then a 5-day week, and that's basically a pound of extra weight gain every 13 weeks, which is a fair amount. Yeah. I think in general for adults, we're happy if people can not gain a pound a year. So not getting a pound every 3 months is pretty good.
Pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important in terms of potential overall energy balance, but then also this aspect of the composition of a healthy diet. So whether consumption of those types of products is offsetting consumption of fruits and vegetables and things that we know are beneficial for health.
Mm-hmm. And I know you did a lot of different, or you looked at a lot of different subgroups here, and divided the group a couple different ways. Did you see any, or what difference did you see between kids who snacked and kids who didn't snack?
Not see differences overall by state law in terms of whether students were snacking. So that was a question for us, whether these state laws, maybe changed what was being offered in schools, and kids were saying, forget it, I won't buy snacks. We did not see a change in snacking behavior according to state laws. We also, when we looked specifically at the students that ate snacks at school, that generally the pattern was fairly consistent. We lost quite a lot of the sample there because about 27% or so of students consumed snacks at school on that given day.
Okay. I want to welcome Joanna Heinen, apologies for my pronunciation, and Gonzalo Salazar de Pablo. We're talking about smart snacks in schools.
I'm just wondering, just talking about the different sort of variables here, I would imagine that a first grader would be very different from a 12th grader in terms of their snacking preferences. And I wonder if you found any differences, if you looked at the results stratified by grade, for example, or age range.
We did control for age in terms of the grade level. We did not stratify because the sample size then would get pretty small. So even with 2,000 students, looking at that level slices it pretty thin.
Yeah. But I mean, from what you're saying, it does sound kind of reassuring, though, that if even, the point of these laws isn't necessarily to stop kids from snacking, but if they are going to snack, then they're going to eat a healthy snack. So I guess this implies there's not like a negative substitution effect. So they're not having nothing instead of potato chips, but if there's bananas and not potato chips, maybe they'll have a banana instead.
Yeah, and that really was the goal of Smart Snacks, to see those less helpful items replaced with better choices. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So what's next for this line of work?
We are continuing to analyze these data, looking at other topics, looking at school meals, looking at other aspects of student dietary consumption and student level outcomes. It's an enormous data set, so there are a lot of opportunities there. It's pretty exciting to be able to work with it.
Right. Well, as Angel has heard me say a number of times, the upside of how terrible I think our nutrition environment is that there's lots of opportunities to study and improve things here. Yes. Which is great. My wife's incidentally a dietitian, and so this stuff's salient. And I know for myself, I live by a Whole Foods. I'm an employed physician. I can afford to shop at Whole Foods. I'm married to a dietitian with a good, healthy attitude. It's really hard for me to make healthy choices. So, if there aren't, the fewer potato chips that are around, the easier it is for me to eat bananas, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Making those choices easier to make by changing the environment, I think, is a big part of it in schools. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. My wife's big trick about me not eating potato chips at home is not buying potato chips to be at home.
Or if you have them at home, then you just try to eat them all at once so that you won't have them again.
Which is a good secondary strategy. All right. Any final thoughts on the paper?
No, it was fun to do and really great opportunity to use this big data set. Yeah.
Great. Well, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This is really great work, and please keep it up.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. All right, so we're going to move on to our table of contents rundown. We've got Mud Alvi who's joined us. Welcome. The first paper is an interesting one. It's that recognizing emotional expression is an outcome measure after face transplant. So this is an interesting case series. They looked at 6 patients who underwent face transplant, which I didn't know there were any of those.
Yes.
Most of what I know about face transplant is from the late 90s movie Face Off.
Off.
Obviously. And which these 6... account for 15% of the worldwide face transplants.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives you some. I mean, that's a pretty good sample.
It
There's
is.
very few times they're able to sample 6% of people with a condition or procedure. And basically, one of the questions around face transplant apparently is how much people are able to, the patients who undergo face transplant are able to kind of do facial expression and people and basically not lose those, I don't know, societal benefits from being able to express emotions, etc. Interesting, they looked at, I guess, universally across all cultures, happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, fear, and disgust are often conveyed by facial expressions. They use software-based facial expression analysis to try to basically do different filming of these patients, and then some 6 healthy controls as well who didn't have surgery. Interestingly, the software wasn't very good and was only able really to assess happiness. And they found that the outcomes they really found was that 43% of or basically 43% of the happiness cues were able to be picked up by the patients. That's compared to about 90% in the healthy controls. And they also found just some other data that mentioned that the patients who undergo face transplant are able to smile over time, which seems like of all the things, if you're able to do that seems pretty important.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I thought one of the things I was wondering about this actually is that a couple of the patients only had partial face transplants, right? And so, but they have this very nice figure that actually demonstrates all of the areas, right, that the software sort of picks up and what that corresponds to anatomically, I guess. But I wondered, the sample's so small, obviously. There's not a huge population of people that are getting this yet. But I did wonder how sort of the software is able to discriminate between a partial face transplant. I think the partial transplants were the middle and the lower face, which kind of makes sense in terms of picking up the expression, happiness, I guess, and sadness too, to some extent.
And I think if I remember correctly, they said that the most of in the healthy controls, most of the emotional cues they were able to find were in the lower part of the face too. So that's good. That makes sense.
Right.
I mean, they're obviously, colloquially, we smile with our eyes, and there's some other wrinkled foreheads and things like that. And they mentioned that as well. But yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing where, again, there's only a handful of patients who've had this worldwide. These are generally people with, I would imagine, fairly devastating injuries and fairly specific situations where, you could undergo transplant. So the fact that there are ways that, can make sure people are, appropriately emotional members of society.
I think so too.
This is nice, promising stuff.
Definitely.
So cool.
Very cool.
And the more I look at this figure, the more it kind of scares me. It looks like American Psycho meets Silence of the Lambs.
Let's move on.
And that's not a transplant patient. That's just a model.
Just the model.
Just the model.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Thanks. What's next?
So next, I think we have, longitudinal assessment of resident performance using Entrustable professional activities. So the objective of this study was to try to measure pediatric trainees' clinical skills over time using this Entrustable professional activities sort of data, or EPAs. And the EPAs are actually, so there's quite a few different types of scales and metrics that are used or have been used to try to assess competency over time and with medical training. The EPA specifically focus on essential activities a trainee should sort of have by the time they are completing training. And the thing that I like about these is that they tend to be, or they try to be more specific, particularly specialty specific, and sort of just less abstract than some other ones that are out there. So this was a prospective cohort study over 3 years. The investigators looked at 23 pediatric residency programs in the U.S. Ultimately, they had 1,987 residents included in the study. Figure 1 demonstrates sort of the growth curves across residency, so using these EPAs essentially. And it's sort of promisingly or reassuringly, you see that they're all sort of headed in the right direction. A couple of things of note: there were a few EPAs that required more, that were still kind of lagging behind, needed continued supervision. One was QI, one was mental and behavioral health, which I assumed meant assessing mental health and not from a personal perspective, right? Yep. And then another one was resuscitation and stabilization of patients, which I thought was sort of interesting because I feel like that's a skill that, at least internal medicine, I guess pediatrics is a little different, but that's a skill that's sort of continually hammered into us. So that was sort of interesting, I thought.
Yeah, I think my favorable view on that one is that there's just not a lot of very sick kids these days, which is a good thing. We like that.
Right.
And there's just not a ton of opportunities necessarily for learning and resuscitation, and it's tough. It's the other kind of good sign here is that the EPA that required the most supervision, and I think that people to the worst, was quality improvement.
Yeah.
And yes, we're all going to be involved in quality improvement in some way, but that's also like that's not like a core clinical task.
Right. No, that's true.
Which is good. I also found it really interesting that the two that they did the best at were referring and handovers.
I did too. Yes, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because I actually thought about how much that reflected sort of recent history and training. Sorry, I didn't mean to take the point away.
Please.
But I feel like that has really become. So first of all, training has just changed dramatically over the last couple of decades, and I think those two skills are things that trainees have had to become adept at, given work hour changes and things of that nature.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. That's exactly what resonated with me. It was especially with how salient the work hour restrictions are, and how one of the big critiques of work hour restrictions is that there's more and more handovers than if people are working forever. But the fact that the residents are doing well at handovers is, to me, shows like, well, good, they're adapting the system. And the bottom line is we all work in healthcare systems now, where a lot of our job is communicating with other professionals, and not just us being these cowboys who do everything ourselves for 48 hours in a row.
Right.
The other thing for me that's really interesting is how, in one way there's a lot of potential negative stuff here, like, oh no, a lot of there's a lot of these EPAs that the grads aren't necessarily reaching competency at graduation. And part of it is are these EPAs not as good as other measures? Is this a bad way to measure competency, or is this a horrible problem? And part of it to me is in the status quo ante, before this kind of stuff, we never really measured it. We just kind of said, all right, do 3 years of training, work your butt off when you're done, pass this test a year and a half later, and you'll be board certified.
Right.
And it strikes me a lot of, I think, some of the move, I've done a lot of work on kind of newer education things, like blogs and podcasts, and there's all these rigorous testing of them and showing whether they work or not, but no one ever really tested like textbooks and lectures.
That's very true.
So I know I'm ranting a little bit, and it's perfect timing because Mila Khan just joined us. But it's just kind of like, yes, we have this new system, and sure, it's not perfect, but was the old system, I don't think, was ever tested in this kind of way.
Right.
And the accompanying invited commentary talked about this a bit, of how, like, great, now we've identified some things to improve on and where the gaps are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I also, I guess, wanted to say, with a couple of the EPAs that, required more supervision, or that's sort of how they measured it, I thought about the fact that more and more medicine is becoming sort of like a team, I shouldn't say team sport, but, team endeavor, I guess, team effort.
Right.
And so I wouldn't be too concerned, in the sense that there's always going to be support no matter where you are. And, increasingly we work with sort of a lot of different people to help us achieve that over time too.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, great. Yeah, so sorry, I have the quote I pulled from the invited commentary, is that the two different things this potentially identified is either, one, curricular shortfalls in residency training requirements that can now be addressed, which is a great positive spin, or two, potential inadequacies of the EPA's chosen for competency assessment in general feeds. So we might just be measuring wrong, but there's also, as far as I know, essentially the first generation of the EPAs. These haven't been revised over years and polished. So is this kind of data that would basically continue, doing continuous assessments to try to figure out what's the best way to do assessments.
Yeah, that's very true.
All right, what's next?
Okay, so this is another really interesting study. It's Association of Health Record Visualizations with Physicians' Cognitive Load when Prioritizing Hospitalized Patients. So I love the term cognitive load. I only recently learned it because my aunt is a sociologist, and she introduced it to me, and I felt like it just encapsulated so much of my life. And so in this setting, this study, the sort of background to this is that these electronic health records, or EHR, sort of the designs increase cognitive workload for physicians. And so this study wanted to assess the association of different design features of an EHR-based information visualization tool with cognitive workload on physicians. So this was a cross-sectional study. It was a convenient sample of physicians using 3 prototypes with different visualizations that highlighted acuity, clinical problem list, and clinical change. And they measured sort of cognitive workload by something called the NASA Task Load Index. And so they ultimately had 29 physician participants. Figures 2 and 3 actually demonstrate these the problem prototype and then the clinical change prototype. And they found a few different things, but ultimately they said, the change prototype seemed to be associated with the lowest cognitive workload. So, this is sort of a proof of concept, I guess you would say. Right. I think
that's what I have written down right
here. Oh,
perfect. Yeah.
Great.
No, and it's interesting to me because they also one of the limitations they note is they didn't compare it against the standard production EHRs.
Yeah.
And also one of the current problems in the current EHR market is there's basically a couple of big gorillas who control the whole market and aren't necessarily going to implement these things, and there's not necessarily a lot of local control to do it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think my biggest frustration with the EHRs, and I've said this before, I'm sure, is how much potential there is to do things better, and just how poorly organized and terrible they are, and how hard it is to find stuff.
Yes, definitely.
And that reminds me, when I was a resident, I was on the part of the clinician team that was giving feedback to our local team when we were going live with one of the big EHRs, and the way that it's set up, they try to push you towards doing like little click boxes instead of free texting. And the free text box that everyone was used to, we had a system that was similar before where you click a couple of things and you can free text what you actually need. But you click this stuff, so you're ticking the boxes in the literal sense. And the way they had done it is the free text box was like in a whole nother tab. So which they talk about this stuff here. And I remember sitting in a meeting saying, and this is the first time I ever used this term, saying like, but going through this stuff and then the cognitive load of going to that second page.
Exactly. Exactly. It's true.
Yeah, no. And I remember I was like probably 30% being ironic about it, but it was like, yeah, it's terrible. My friend Nick Jeans, I remember him just like laughing in his boots and calling me out for it. But yeah, no, it's terrible. And we're doing so many things when we're working. There's so much stuff. I really like how this is taking, this big morass of data we have that's usually divided in a bunch of different places and saying, hey, here are the relevant things. Look at these. These are, I believe, designed for hospitalized patients. Yeah. And the idea is look at these first because this patient had the most change or this patient has the most things going on.
Right.
Which really just makes a lot of sense. So.
Definitely. I also just thought, it was just kind of creative, I thought, to me. And I like the fact that, we hear a lot about design thinking or design-centered thinking. And this is just one way in which we that's kind of being brought into healthcare, which I appreciate.
Absolutely, and there's certainly more of that. And not designing is a design choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so next up, switching gears a bit, this is an interesting paper. It's a secondary analysis of the wrist RCT, which is a very cleverly named study of distal radius fractures. So the secondary analysis, this was for older patients with displaced distal radial fractures, randomized to 4 groups who got either 3 types of surgery or just casting. And it was volar locking plate, perc pinning, external fixation, or casting. There were about 166 people in the secondary analysis, average age of 71. And basically they're trying to see if of these patients, after they got treatment, if anatomic alignment resulted in different functional outcomes. And basically the answer was resoundingly no. They looked at 84 different correlation coefficients. There were only 2 that were statistically significant positive, which basically 2 out of 84 means, not even a trend towards positivity. The 2 were a degree in radial inclination away from normal or millimeters towards ulnar variance. And the first one led to slightly decreased grip strength, and the second was a slight decrease in the ADL score. None of these resulted in any actual differences in how patients functioned. And basically, their conclusion was that this supported that precise restoration of wrist anatomy is not associated with better patient outcomes, which makes a lot of sense. To kind of put it all together, there's an invited commentary which is titled, "Do Patients Care What Their X-rays Look Like?" And as Betteridge's law would tell us, the answer is no, basically. And this doesn't mean not to reduce people. This is after treatment. And there's basically, seems to be in the last couple years, a pretty big I'd say continuation of a discussion about how much we really need to do to make distal radius fractures look totally pretty.
Yeah.
And the answers continue to seem to be not much. Just basically get the bones aligned, get people functioning well.
Yeah.
And if it's, off like that instead of off like that, probably doesn't make a difference.
I mean, I wondered how much of this was a function of the fact that because they were specifically looking at older adults, right? And so not to say that age necessarily has anything to do with, functional status,
Sure.
but more just sort of the types of activities that a person might be engaged in that may make a difference. But I really liked the line in the conclusion of the abstract, actually, which is one of the reasons I really liked the study, was that surgeons can consider this evidence to improve quality of care by prioritizing patient preferences and efficient use of resources over achieving exact realignment. I love that.
Yeah, exactly. Just really good patient-centered care.
Yeah.
And welcome, Steve Morales is joining us. We're finishing up talking about distal radius fractures. But yeah, and I just think, that we can do, and I think there's just big metaphor for healthcare, especially in like late 90s, early 2000s, of like we can do lots of fancy technical things to make numbers look really good.
Yeah.
But that's not what actually matters for the patients. Mina Cedric's joined us too. Welcome, Mina. And I think that, the lesson is, the flip side, talking about the older patients, the flip side of that is, they may not need to do more, but they were looking at fairly standardized things like
That's
ADLs.
True. Yeah.
But also if they're older patients, there's probably a lot less functional reserve, so less
true.
Tolerance for loss of function.
Right.
And really just not having, major differences. And it's great. And a lot of this stuff, from my point of view, this doesn't, for big, obvious displaced fractures, we're still going to reduce them. But a lot of the time we're looking at it like, the angles are different. And by the book, the numbers might look bad. But if the patient looks okay, is it worth putting the patient through a painful procedure, putting them at risk of sedation, just the amount of time they spend in the ED, the extra effort for everyone, the opportunity cost of everything else everyone else could be doing. And if it's all in the end going to work out the same for the patient, why go through the whole mess just because it bills surprising like 5 RVUs?
Yeah, I agree.
Hey, Howard, our editor-in-chief, is joining us. All right, we've got one more. What's up next?
Yes, okay, so this is prediagnostic immune cell profiles and breast cancer. So apparently there's a potential association with an increased risk of breast cancer and overall leukocyte counts in women. But this study actually looked at specific leukocyte subtypes, so B cells, natural killer cells, things of that nature, to see sort of how that potentially was associated with breast cancer risk. And they did this by measuring actually whole blood DNA methylation, which was cool, so they looked at 2,774 non-Hispanic white women and found a few things. So overall, circulating B cell populations were positively associated with later breast cancer, developing breast cancer later. In the postmenopausal patients, they found that B cells, again, were associated with breast cancer overall. And then in all women, they actually found that increasing circulating monocytes were actually associated with a decreased near-term risk of breast cancer. So, I'm always a little bit hesitant when we talk about sort of biomarkers because it's really hard to say what this all means.
Right.
But it is sort of interesting to look at, I like thinking about the subtypes of leukocytes in my own line of work. So it's kind of nice to see it in another, as another potential place of use.
Yeah, no, and I think as long as, this is pretty early, I wouldn't say basic science, but pretty close to basic science. And they're not saying, hey, we should start, screening people for monocytes at their 60-year-old visits or whatever.
Right.
Like that.
Right.
But I say this is kind of early in the phase of hypothesis generation for potential scanning later on and identifying targets and things like that. And I'm glad that other people are doing it so I don't have to look at different types of circulating subtypes.
Yes. Definitely. I did like the figure. It was kind of cool.
It's very pretty.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
It's very nice. Yeah, no, it's good. It's nice. Again, this is good stuff. I think, and also just figuring out ways. I'm curious if there's ways we're going to be able to pair this, do this test paired with, say, or a test that's derived from this down the road, paired with something like routine mammograms to help better identify people who need things like biopsies or follow up or things like that. I don't know.
No, I agree. It's interesting because with the last paper, I was thinking, okay, we treat the patient, we don't treat the test. But here, I'm actually thinking, maybe the test might come in handy at some point.
Wait, oh no, at some point, yes, at some point we do tests. Like,
we do. It's true.
It's my fear with all sorts of screening tests is always just the false positives.
Yes.
And even when the false positives don't lead to any actual intervention, just the stress, the hang up, the limited attention everybody has to do all these things, and just how much resources we devote into things, and making sure that we're finding worthwhile clinical targets that do matter for patients. And again, if they were saying, hey, we should start doing this right now, like panels, I'd be very negative. But this is early in the chain of figuring out diagnostic science down the road.
Definitely.
So, great. All right.
Excellent.
Well, thanks for joining us this week. Join us next week as well, Tuesday, 3 p.m. Central Time. Follow us on the usual social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Pinterest, YouTube, at JAMA Network Open, and of course get new articles 10 a.m. every Wednesday and Friday, 10 a.m. Central Time, where everything's JAMANetworkOpen.com, where everything's free and open access. And of course, you can get the author interview portion of these videos as audio alone on podcasts wherever you subscribe.
I think I just need to make a correction because I think I said for this last paper, I think I said postmenopausal and I meant premenopausal.
Oh, okay.
Just as an aside.
Great. That's peer review in action.
Yes, exactly.
Because who's a better peer than yourself? And of course, if you're still following with us, Angel Desai did a great JAMA, was it a clinical reviews podcast on animal bites, which includes all of the different types of animal bites from dogs, cats, bats, arthropods, snakes, and humans.
Yes.
And I think there is a crocodile,
alligator.
I always mix those two up. Actually, a couple years ago, my cousin asked me the difference between crocodile and alligator, and I was like, I know a little bit, and I looked it up, and it turns out there's so much overlap, I just don't need to know.
No.
All right, take care.
Bye.